Do you remember the things your family just couldn't afford at the grocery store back in the 60s? The things you'd see sitting behind that glass case or stacked neatly on a shelf, shining under the fluorescent lights. But you'd walk right past because you knew better than to even ask? So today, let's take a walk down those aisles again. Let's talk about 20 grocery items many black families simply couldn't afford in the 60s and what those foods really meant. Sirloin steak. You could smell it before you saw it. The butcher's counter lined with thick, marbled sirloin, glistening under bright lights that made every cut look like a celebration. For white suburban families, steak night was a midweek tradition. For most black families in the 60s, it was a dream. Back then, sirloin went for about $1.20 a pound. That doesn't sound like much now, but in those days, it was nearly 10% of a week's grocery money for just 1 pound. Families stuck with ground beef at 63 cents a pound or stretched a pot of beans with a little pork fat. You learned to make flavor from patience and time, not price tags. Today, steak is still expensive, but it's accessible. You can catch a sale, swipe a card, grill it in your backyard. But imagine standing in that store 60 years ago, knowing a single steak could mean the week's vegetables had to go back on the shelf. Do you remember what your family used to make instead of steak? Lobster. Now, lobster, let's be honest, wasn't even on the radar. In the 60s, lobster ran about $1.50 a pound, or nearly 12% of a family's weekly food money. And that's if you lived near the coast. For families in the South or the Midwest, you weren't seeing lobster unless it came in a newspaper photo. What's wild is, just a few decades earlier, lobster was considered poor man's food, fed to prisoners and servants. But by the 1960s, it had been reborn as a delicacy. For most black households, though, seafood meant something else. Fried catfish on Fridays, maybe canned tuna or sardines when the check was thin. Now we post pictures of lobster tails online like trophies. But think about your grandparents. Could they have ever imagined a plate of lobster drenched in butter sitting on their table? Shrimp. You know that smell when shrimp hits a hot skillet. Salty, buttery, the scent of a special occasion. That smell was a luxury. In the 1960s, fresh shrimp cost around 89 cents a pound, another 7% of a weekly budget gone in one swoop. Maybe folks down in Louisiana could get it cheaper, straight from the docks. But for most families, shrimp came in cans or not at all. Instead, you'd find tins of tuna stacked in pantries, 25 cents a can, maybe a splash of mayo to make it stretch. That was the seafood special for many families. Today, shrimp cocktail shows up at every party platter. But back then, seafood was a reminder of where you couldn't shop. So tell me, what was your family's version of fancy on Fridays? Fresh salmon. Picture the pink flesh of a fresh salmon fillet laid out on crushed ice, the kind of thing that made you pause even if you couldn't buy it. $1 a pound doesn't sound steep, but when you're counting every dime, that's 8% of the week's budget for one meal. Fresh salmon was for someone else's dinner table. Instead, you'd see sardines, 19 cents a can, oily, salty, eaten with crackers when the pantry ran low. Or maybe mackerel from a tin, bones and all. That was the working man's fish. But somehow, those meals carried more warmth than anything served on white linen. Now you can find salmon in bulk at warehouse stores, but back then, it was a postcard from a world you weren't invited to. Do you remember who in your family made miracles out of canned fish? Lamb chops. Now, lamb chops. Those were the kind of meat that sounded fancy even before you saw the price tag. 95 cents a pound, around 8% of a week's money. But even if you could afford it, most families didn't grow up cooking lamb. It wasn't part of the Southern table. It was something you saw in magazines, served with mint jelly next to crystal glasses. Chicken was the comfort food. 29 cents a pound, fried crisp or stewed slow with onions and rice. It wasn't about luxury. It was about survival and flavor. Lamb was foreign. Chicken was home. Today, we call those old meals soul food. But back then, they were just what you did to keep the family fed. Do you still remember how the kitchen smelled on chicken frying days? Prime rib roast. Picture a Sunday table set with a prime rib roast, thick, red, juices pooling under a silver knife. In 1965, that roast might have cost $1.40 a pound, 12% of the weekly grocery money. That was a holiday splurge, maybe Christmas if things went right that year. Most black families didn't see that kind of meat unless it came as leftovers from white employers or special community dinners. Pork was the everyday staple, cheap, familiar, and forgiving. You could buy neck bones for 29 cents a pound and make them taste like a feast. That's what made soul food more than survival. It was art born out of limitation. Now, prime rib is a restaurant item. But imagine being a kid in 1964, watching TV commercials for it, knowing that your mama's pot roast, made from chuck, not rib, was the best thing you'd ever taste. When was the last time you smelled a roast slow cooking on Sunday and thought about how far your family's table has come? Avocados. Before avocado toast, before guacamole bowls at every party, there was a time when avocados were a mystery. In the 1960s, they cost a quarter each, about 2% of a week's grocery money. Not much, maybe. But that was for one piece of fruit that most people didn't know how to eat. Avocados were imported, exotic, something you saw in California or on the cover of a Good Housekeeping magazine. In most black communities, especially in the South, the green fruit didn't even make it to the shelves. Families bought what they knew: collard greens, sweet potatoes, cabbage, real food, food that filled you up and told a story about home. Today, avocados are in every store. But think about your grandmother's kitchen. No avocados, no yogurt, no kale smoothies, and yet somehow those meals kept generations strong. What new food would have made your elders laugh back then? Fresh pineapple. You ever see a fresh pineapple sitting in a grocery display? Golden, spiky, like a jewel? In the 1960s, roughly 3% of a week's food money. Too much for fruit that didn't stretch. Too expensive for everyday sweetness. Instead, families reached for canned fruit. Peaches, pears, fruit cocktail in syrup. 19 cents a can, good for dessert or a child's lunch. Pineapple was for show, but somehow that canned sweetness became part of every family recipe, from ambrosia to upside-down cake, proof that you could still make joy out of a tin can. Now we slice pineapples without a thought, but imagine the first time you tasted something that didn't come from a can. Do you remember the first real fruit that made you feel like times were changing? Artichokes. You ever notice how some foods just look like money? Artichokes were like that. Green, spiky, strange little crowns sitting in the produce aisle. In the 1960s, one artichoke cost about 29 cents. Doesn't sound like much, but when your family's stretching $12 to feed 5 mouths for the week, one artichoke meant less bread, less sugar, maybe less meat. And truth be told, artichokes didn't even belong in most southern kitchens. Nobody's grandma was boiling those things or dipping them in butter. Collards, mustard greens, turnip greens, that's what you grew, picked, washed in cold water till your hands went numb. Those greens cost about 15 cents a bunch, and you could feed a house full of people with them. Still, the artichoke had a kind of mystery to it. You'd see it in the newspaper inserts, sitting beside steaks or fancy dips, and you'd wonder what it even tasted like. These days, you can buy a jar of marinated artichokes at any grocery store, but back then, it was a vegetable from another world. Be honest, if your mama had brought one home in the 60s, what would she have even done with it? Fresh asparagus. Asparagus wasn't just expensive. It was out of season, and that meant double the price. 39 cents a pound, sometimes more in the winter. The thing about the 60s is, produce wasn't shipped halfway across the world like it is now. You ate what was in season, and you made peace with it. Fresh asparagus was the kind of thing you'd see served in white homes on Easter, a bright green sign of spring. Meanwhile, your family was probably serving peas, 10 cents a bag, frozen, seasoned right, with a pat of margarine and salt. You couldn't afford to eat for looks. You ate for life. Today, asparagus is year-round, but picture the 60s. Stores in black neighborhoods didn't even stock it because they knew their customers couldn't justify spending 3% of the week's food budget on something that barely filled a plate. So tell me, if you'd been in that store, would you have reached for the asparagus or doubled up on rice and beans instead? Brie cheese. Let's talk about cheese. Not government cheese, not Velveeta, not that brick you had to saw through with a knife, but brie, imported from France, creamy, soft, wrapped in white paper like a secret. In the 1960s, brie ran about $1.50 a pound, 12% of the weekly grocery money for something that melted faster than butter. Back then, black families didn't have supermarkets full of imported goods. Most shopped at corner stores, where cheese came in blocks or cans. Government surplus programs handed out that stiff orange cheese that barely melted but stretched across everything: macaroni, grits, sandwiches, and that was enough. Brie was something you saw on television, maybe in a women's magazine next to a glass of wine you couldn't afford either. Now you can walk into Walmart and buy a wheel of brie for less than $15. But think about your grandmother's refrigerator. One shelf, maybe two. A jug of milk, leftovers, lard in a jar, no fancy cheese, no luxury, just survival dressed up as Sunday dinner. You think she'd laugh if she saw you paying $20 for soft ripened anything? Imported olives. Picture a glass jar of olives, green, glossy, floating in brine like jewels. 49 cents a jar back in the day, around 4% of the week's grocery money. Most families didn't even see them outside of holiday tables or photographs. Black families in the 1960s knew how to pickle, though. Okra, cucumbers, green tomatoes. You didn't need to buy flavor. You made it. You filled mason jars in the summer and sealed them tight for the winter. But those imported olives from Italy or Spain, that was luxury food. The kind you'd see sitting in glass bowls at cocktail parties you weren't invited to. Today, olives come in bulk jars at discount stores, part of every Mediterranean diet. But think about that word, imported. In the 60s, imported meant unattainable. Do you remember the first time you saw a jar of something you couldn't pronounce and you wondered who it was meant for? Mangoes. Before mangoes were smoothie staples, they were foreign, 29 cents each, and that was considered cheap for something flown in from somewhere most folks couldn't point to on a map. For black families, fruit meant apples, oranges, bananas, things you could buy by the pound. Mangoes were exotic, a word that didn't even belong in the same sentence as grocery list. The first mango most people ever tasted was probably decades later, when grocery stores diversified and shipping costs dropped. Back then, canned peaches were the treat. The syrup, thick and golden, poured over biscuits or ice cream on special occasions. The kind of sweetness you saved for the end of the week when payday finally came through. Mangoes were for another class, another coast, another life. Now they're sliced, frozen, bagged, and sold for a few dollars. But imagine being a kid in the 60s and seeing one for the first time. Bright, smooth, smelling like sunshine. Would you even have believed it was meant to be eaten? Caviar. Now here's one for the rich, the kind of thing you heard about but never actually saw. Caviar, tiny black pearls of fish. Eggs sitting in crystal bowls. $5 an ounce back then, the equivalent of $85 today, for a single ounce. To most black families, that price was unthinkable. That's 40% of the weekly food budget, gone in a spoonful. Caviar wasn't food, it was a symbol. A way of saying, we have what you don't. The very idea of it stood in contrast to the way black households made abundance out of scarcity. Instead of fish eggs, there was fried catfish. Instead of champagne, there was sweet tea. Instead of luxury, there was love and laughter around the kitchen table. Yet, in some way, that resilience was its own form of wealth, something no caviar could ever match. Today, you can find cheap caviar at supermarkets. But would your grandparents even have wanted it? Or would they have looked at that jar and said, "Baby, for that price, I can feed the whole block"? Unsalted butter. In the 1960s, butter wasn't a staple. It was a wish. 69 cents a pound, which worked out to about 6% of a week's grocery money. Instead, margarine ruled the kitchen. 29 cents a pound, sold in big yellow tubs or foil-wrapped sticks. If you grew up in a southern kitchen, you know the ritual. Spreading margarine on toast, stirring it into grits, or melting it over rice. Butter was for baking holidays, if at all. And yet, the scent of real butter melting in a hot pan, that was a kind of luxury you didn't forget. The irony? Back then, unsalted butter wasn't even the fancy version. It was just less common. Salted butter lasted longer, and shelf life was everything. Today, we have choices. But in the 60s, you didn't need 5 kinds of butter to make love taste like home. Do you remember the first time you saw someone bake with real butter instead of margarine? Whole bean coffee. Picture this, a bag of whole coffee beans, rich and fragrant. In the 1960s, that bag cost around 89 cents a pound, too much for most families scraping by. Instant coffee was the standard, a jar for 39 cents that could last the month. But coffee wasn't just a drink, it was ritual. Mornings started with the smell of chicory brewing on the stove, especially in the South, that deep, roasted scent filling the kitchen, cutting through the cool air before sunrise. Whole bean coffee, though, that was for city folks, for people with grinders and percolators that cost more than your week's groceries. It represented a kind of leisure, a slow morning you couldn't afford. These days, we sip $6 lattes without blinking. But imagine your father in 1964, heading to work before dawn, pouring instant coffee into a thermos. He didn't need foam art, he needed strength. What would he think of the way we drink coffee now? Belgian chocolate. Chocolate, the kind that came in boxes wrapped with ribbon. Belgian chocolate cost $1 a box back then, about 8% of a weekly food budget. That's not candy for kids, that's candy for company. Most children in black neighborhoods grew up with Hershey bars, 10 cents a piece if you had spare change, or penny candy from the corner store. You didn't buy chocolate to impress, you bought it to share. Belgian chocolate, though, that was for anniversaries, gifts, maybe something you saw in a magazine. Now, it's everywhere. You can buy it in drugstores or order it online. But think back, what was your treat growing up? That one thing you'd save your coins for, just to taste something sweet after a long week. Walnuts, shelled. A bag of shelled walnuts cost 89 cents a pound in the 60s, 7% of the week's food budget. Too expensive for baking, too impractical for snacking. Instead, families bought peanuts, 25 cents a pound, full of protein, roasted or boiled, depending on where you were from. Walnuts were for recipes that called for extras, cakes, salads, holiday pies, and extras weren't part of survival cooking. Every ingredient had to count, had to fill bellies. Today, walnuts are sold by the pound in bulk bins. But imagine your grandmother baking without them, using what she had. Pecans from a neighbor's tree, maybe, or nothing at all. And somehow, that pie still tasted like love. Fresh crab meat. There's something about fresh crab meat, the way it flakes between your fingers, the sweetness that hits your tongue after the salt. But for most black families in the 1960s, that sweetness was out of reach. A pound of fresh crab cost about $1.25 back then, 10% of a weekly grocery budget. That kind of price was reserved for coastal families or restaurants. Inland, it was a rumor. The truth is, most black families found their seafood in cans. Tuna for 25 cents, sardines for 19. You'd mash them with onions, mix in a bit of mustard, and call it a meal. Still, the idea of crab held power. It wasn't just food, it was aspiration. The kind of thing you'd dream of tasting one day, maybe when the kids were grown and money wasn't so tight. Now you can buy crab cakes in frozen packs, but think about that moment, standing in a store in 1964, seeing that handwritten sign over the seafood counter and knowing it wasn't for you. Even so, folks made feasts from what they had. Catfish, whiting, or even fried bologna if payday hadn't come yet. They turned the ordinary into something sacred. Do you remember that one dish your folks made that felt rich, even when money was thin? Out-of-season strawberries. There's no smell like fresh strawberries. Sweet, tart, like summer bottled in a scent. But in the 1960s, that scent was seasonal. You got strawberries in June, maybe July. Out of season, they were 49 cents a pint, 4% of a week's grocery money. Too steep for fruit that disappeared in 2 days. So families made do. They bought jam, canned fruit, or learned to preserve their own when summer came. Jars of strawberry preserves lined pantry shelves, sealed tight to remind you of sunshine in winter. That's how black households survived the seasons, by preparing for them. Fresh fruit wasn't a given, it was a reward, something you waited for, not demanded. And waiting taught patience, gratitude, and a quiet pride in the art of saving. Today, strawberries are stacked in stores 12 months a year. But back then, getting them in November felt almost magical. Do you remember the first time you tasted something fresh after a long winter? Now, let's step back for a moment, because these 20 items weren't just groceries, they were signposts in a larger story. Each one pointed to a bigger truth about what it meant to be black and poor in the 1960s. You had families working full-time, sometimes double shifts, still bringing home less than $4,000 a year. Rent took its bite. Bills followed close behind. What remained went straight to the kitchen table. The math was cruel. 17% of that income, about $50 a month, was all you had to feed a household. And those prices you've been hearing, they didn't fall evenly across America. In black neighborhoods, grocery prices could run 10 to 20% higher than in white suburbs. Stores there weren't chain supermarkets. They were mom-and-pop shops, small and often overpriced because they had no competition. And when supermarkets did exist nearby, they weren't built for everyone. Redlining, segregation, and transportation barriers meant many black families had to travel miles just to find affordable food, and few had the time, gas money, or car to do it. So, when we talk about these 20 items, we're not just listing prices. We're talking about access, about dignity, about who got to eat what and why. Picture this, your mother standing in line with a paper bag full of basics, cornmeal, beans, rice, a few cans of vegetables, maybe a slab of bacon if the week was good. She counts every coin before the cashier rings it up. Behind her, there's a display case full of things she'll never buy. Fresh meats, imported cheeses, fruit from other continents. She doesn't look twice at them. Not because she doesn't want them, but because she's already learned to stretch what she has. She knows how to turn fat back into flavor, lard into pie crust, and leftovers into Sunday supper. That was the genius of black cooking in those years. It was born of necessity, but it blossomed into art. The soul food we celebrate today came from a time when butter was too costly, steak was a fantasy, and shrimp was a once-in-a-lifetime treat. But beyond the kitchen, there was something deeper. Resilience. Activists like Fannie Lou Hamer saw that hunger wasn't just about food, it was about power. She started cooperatives in Mississippi, helping black farmers grow and share what they had so no one went without. In Oakland, the Black Panther Party fed children free breakfast before school. Grits, eggs, milk, fruit. Meals that for some kids were the only real food they'd get that day. Those programs didn't just fill stomachs, they filled gaps the system refused to see. Even in the rural South, communities came together. Churches ran fish fries, neighbors traded garden crops, and families shared what little they had. It wasn't charity, it was survival wrapped in love. Now let's imagine something for a moment. You're back in that kitchen. It's 1965. There's a pot on the stove, steam rising, the smell of onions and smoked meat drifting through the house. The radio's playing Sam Cooke. Maybe a change is gonna come. Your mother's stirring the pot with a tired hand, humming along, the sound mixing with the simmer. She's thinking about bills, about what's left in the pantry, about how to make enough to stretch through Friday. But when she tastes that broth, she smiles. Because somehow, against all odds, it's good, better than good. It's love made edible. That's what those unaffordable items missed. They might have had price tags of luxury, but they couldn't buy the warmth of that kitchen, the rhythm of that spoon scraping the bottom of the pot. That's the secret history of black food in the 1960s. It wasn't about deprivation, it was about invention, turning scraps into sustenance and sustenance into soul. And even now, when you walk into a grocery store, automatic doors sliding open, aisles stretching farther than your eyes can see, there's a quiet echo of those years. Every shelf stacked high, every sale sign flashing bright is a reminder of a time when choices were limited. But creativity wasn't. When you grab that butter or salmon or avocado, you're carrying a legacy. You're living proof of how far those kitchens came, how much was built from so little. Because back in the 1960s, being unable to afford something didn't mean you couldn't make something. It meant you had to. And somehow, through that struggle, Black America wrote an entire culinary language the world now calls soul food. Not out of luxury, but out of love. You see, the 1960s weren't just about what was missing from the table. They were about what was created in spite of it. The flavor, the rhythm, the patience. The pride of knowing that even if the world priced you out of steak and lobster, it could never take away your seasoning, your stories, or your strength. So when we talk about those 20 grocery items, sirloin steak, lobster, shrimp, salmon, lamb chops, prime rib, avocados, pineapples, artichokes, asparagus, brie, olives, mangoes, caviar, butter, coffee, Belgian chocolate, walnuts, crab, and strawberries, we're really talking about something bigger. The power of making enough out of not enough. That's the kind of memory you carry in your hands every time you cook. Betty Crocker cake mixes. Betty Crocker cake mixes ranked 25th because they represented an affordable path to celebration during lean times. In African-American households of the 1970s, these boxes promised homemade dignity without the expense of individual ingredients. You could transform a dollar box into a birthday cake, a church social contribution, or a Sunday dessert that made hard weeks feel momentarily sweeter. The mixes required only eggs, oil, and water, stretching limited budgets while maintaining the appearance of effort and care. For families navigating economic hardship, these boxes offered psychological relief alongside actual dessert. The positives were undeniable. Cake mixes democratized celebration, allowing poor families to participate in the rituals that marked life's milestones. They were foolproof enough for children to help, creating memories in kitchens where joy had to be manufactured from minimal resources. The negatives, however, centered on nutritional emptiness and the artificial aftertaste that no amount of frosting could completely mask. These cakes tasted like compromise, their chemical sweetness a constant reminder of what real baking required. Betty Crocker mixes occupy this low ranking because while they solved immediate problems, they represented the beginning of processed food dependency that would plague poor communities for decades. They worked, but they were merely adequate survival tools rather than genuine nourishment. Store-brand cornflakes. Generic cornflakes in giant clear bags ranked 24th. The breakfast of absolute necessity. These flakes came without cartoon mascots, without individual packaging, without the promise of prizes. African-American families bought them because a massive bag cost what 2 small boxes of name-brand cereal did, and when you're feeding multiple children before school, mathematics trumps marketing every time. The bags were impossible to pour without creating avalanches across kitchen counters, and the flakes went stale within days of opening. But they filled bowls and bellies. The texture was aggressively mediocre. These flakes achieved sogginess within seconds of milk contact, transforming from crunchy to cardboard-like with depressing speed. Children learned to eat quickly, racing against the inevitable dissolution, yet the positives existed in pure economics. One bag could last a family 2 weeks if portions were controlled, and, when paired with government-issued powdered milk, breakfast happened regardless of the paycheck situation. In communities where food insecurity was constant, this reliability mattered more than taste. The negatives, however, extended beyond flavor. These generic generic cereals reminded children daily of their economic status, especially when classmates discussed Frosted Flakes or Cap'n Crunch. The psychological cost of poverty has a taste, and it tastes like generic cornflakes drowning in reconstituted milk. Canned pork and beans. Canned pork and beans landed at 23, the protein source that required zero skill and minimal investment. In the 1970s, African-American households could purchase these cans for under 30 cents, and inside waited tender beans and sweet sauce with maybe a cube of actual pork floating somewhere. The beans were pre-cooked, requiring only heating, which mattered enormously in households where both parents worked multiple jobs and cooking time was a luxury nobody possessed. Additionally, the cultural context was significant. Beans had always been a staple in African-American cuisine, from field peas to black-eyed peas, but canned pork and beans represented the industrialization of traditional foodways. What grandmothers once simmered for hours now came from a can in 5 minutes. This was progress and loss simultaneously. The positives included convenience, affordability, and the beans' ability to stretch into multiple meals. Pour them over rice, serve them beside hot dogs, mix them into whatever casserole needed bulk. The negatives, on the other hand, centered on nutrition and taste. These beans swam in high-fructose corn syrup masquerading as tomato sauce, their sweetness cloying and artificial. The sodium content could season a week's worth of home cooking. The mysterious pork cube offered more questions than sustenance, yet families bought them repeatedly because when poverty forces you to choose between quick calories and slow starvation, you choose the can every time. This middling ranking acknowledges both their utility and their inadequacy. Margarine. Margarine ranked 22nd, the butter imposter that fooled nobody but cost half as much. Brands like Parquet and Bluebonnet became household names in African-American communities, where real butter was a luxury reserved for special occasions or non-existent altogether. This hydrogenated oil product came in tubs, its nuclear yellow color achieved through artificial dyes rather than actual dairy. It spread easily, melted into casseroles, and topped pancakes while maintaining the fiction that you weren't sacrificing quality for affordability. In Black households of the 1970s, margarine represented a specific kind of compromise. Traditional Southern cooking relied heavily on butter, lard, and bacon grease for flavor, but economic pressure pushed families toward cheaper alternatives. Margarine became the daily reality, while butter remained the holiday dream. The positives were purely economic. Margarine lasted longer than butter, didn't require refrigeration as strictly, and could be used interchangeably in most recipes without disaster. It made vegetables tolerable for children, gave toast a slick surface for jelly, and contributed to the mouthfeel of poverty cuisine. The negatives, though, included health implications nobody fully understood in the 1970s. Trans fats would later be identified as dangerous, but poor families consumed them daily out of necessity. The taste was distinctly plastic, leaving an oily film on the tongue and a chemical aftertaste. Yet margarine's ubiquity in struggling households made it a shared experience, a unifying marker of economic status. Canned salmon. In African-American households of the 1970s, fresh fish was often expensive or unavailable, but canned salmon offered omega-3s and protein in a shelf-stable format. The experience of opening these cans was memorable for all the wrong reasons. The liquid drained out pink and slightly cloudy. The salmon chunks came with skin still attached, and those tiny bones created textural surprises that children learned to navigate cautiously. Salmon patties became a cultural staple, partly from necessity, partly from ingenuity. Mix the canned fish with eggs, breadcrumbs, and onions, then fry them into crispy patties that stretched one can into dinner for 6 people. This was African-American culinary creativity. Born from constraint, transforming budget ingredients into something approaching comfort food. The positives included genuine nutritional value. Unlike many poverty foods, canned salmon delivered actual protein and healthy fats, making it one of the more defensible budget choices. The negatives were sensory. The smell of canned salmon permeated kitchens and clung to clothes, announcing economic status to anyone who walked through the door. The bones, while technically edible and calcium-rich, created a psychological barrier for children. The mushy texture also felt wrong compared to any other meat. This middle ranking acknowledges salmon's nutritional superiority while recognizing the compromises its consumption required. It was better than many alternatives, but it still tasted like poverty. Cream of mushroom soup. In African-American households of the 1970s, Campbell's cream of mushroom soup cans were essential infrastructure. One can transformed a handful of ingredients into an entire dish. Mix it with green beans and fried onions for a holiday side. Stir it into ground beef and noodles for a weeknight dinner, or simply pour it over chicken and rice for Sunday supper. The soup's thick, salty consistency masked the absence of more expensive ingredients while providing the illusion of richness. The cultural adaptation was significant. Traditional African-American cooking relied on gravies and sauces made from pan drippings and careful simmering, but cream of mushroom soup offered a shortcut when time and ingredients were scarce. Working mothers especially embraced it as a tool for feeding families quickly after long shifts. The positives here centered on versatility and convenience. These cans could rescue almost any meal that needed moisture and flavor. They were cheap, lasting, and required zero culinary skill. The negatives, on the other hand, were nutritional and gastronomic. The soup was essentially sodium, flour, and chemicals shaped into something vaguely cream-like. The mushrooms were barely identifiable gray lumps. Fresh taste was nowhere in the equation. Yet this soup became so embedded in poverty cooking that entire generations associate it with home meals and family dinners. Evaporated milk. Evaporated milk landed at 19, concentrated dairy that promised richness while delivering something distinctly metallic and off. In struggling African-American households, these small cans served multiple purposes. Add water to create drinking milk. Pour it straight into coffee for a cream substitute. Use it in baking to add moisture and fake luxury. The milk had been heated until 60% of its water content evaporated, then sealed in cans that could survive years on pantry shelves, waiting for the moment when fresh dairy wasn't an option. The cultural context here involves the broader issue of lactose intolerance in Black communities. Many African-American families experienced digestive issues with dairy products, yet evaporated milk's concentration somehow made it more tolerable, or at least no worse than fresh milk. It became the compromise position between no dairy and expensive fresh products. Positives in this product included extreme shelf stability and versatility. A single can could enhance multiple meals throughout the week, from breakfast coffee to dinner casseroles to weekend desserts. The negatives, though, were sensory and nutritional. Evaporated milk tasted wrong, like dairy that had been through trauma and never recovered. It lent a slightly sour tin can flavor to everything it touched. The concentration process destroyed much of the nutritional value, leaving behind mostly fat and calories. Yet families relied on it because it represented dairy accessibility in food deserts where fresh milk was expensive or unavailable. Instant mashed potatoes. Instant mashed potatoes ranked 18th, the side dish that required only boiling water and surrender of dignity. Brands like Idahoan and Betty Crocker sold these flakes to African-American families as modern convenience, but they were really time-saving necessities for households where both parents worked and cooking had to happen in minutes rather than hours. The flakes came in boxes or pouches, looking like dried paint chips that promised to become fluffy potatoes through the magic of reconstitution. Just add hot water, butter if you had it, milk if you could spare it, and stir until the lumps are dissolved. The texture was the giveaway. Real mashed potatoes had variations, little chunks of potato, slight graininess that spoke to their origin. Instant potatoes achieved an unsettling uniformity, smooth and slightly gluey, like wallpaper paste that had been seasoned. Children could tell the difference, but learned not to complain when parents were doing their best with limited resources. The positives were speed and storage. Instant potatoes never spoiled, required no peeling or boiling, and could be prepared by anyone old enough to work a stove. In households juggling multiple jobs and multiple children, this mattered enormously. But, of course, there were negatives, which extended beyond taste. These potatoes represented another step away from traditional cooking, another convenience that eroded culinary skills and food knowledge. They were nutritionally inferior to real potatoes, stripped of fiber and nutrients during processing. Yet they appeared on tables throughout Black America, because survival sometimes means accepting the instant over the authentic. Tang. In African-American households of the 1970s, Tang represented space-age sophistication at poverty prices. One jar of this powder could create gallons of orangish drink, making it exponentially cheaper than actual orange juice. The marketing was brilliant, associating this artificial concoction with astronauts and achievement, while selling it to families who could barely afford groceries. Children mixed it in pitchers, watching the powder dissolve into neon orange liquid that bore no resemblance to any citrus fruit but tasted sweet enough to disguise tap water. The cultural significance was complex. Orange juice had always been considered a luxury, something associated with wealthy families and weekend brunches. Tang democratized the orange juice experience, even if that experience was fundamentally fake. Black children could drink something orange at breakfast and feel like they weren't completely missing out. The positives here centered on cost and convenience. Tang never spoiled, required no refrigeration before mixing, and made water exciting for children who otherwise might not hydrate properly. The negatives, however, were substantial. Tang was essentially vitamin C mixed with sugar and artificial flavoring, offering minimal nutritional value despite its fortification. The sweetness was cloying, the aftertaste chemical, the orange flavor a suggestion rather than reality. It stained everything it touched, from countertops to children's upper lips. This middle-tier ranking acknowledges Tang's role in making breakfast feel complete while recognizing its contribution to sugar dependence and the normalization of artificial food in poor communities. Saltine crackers. Saltine crackers ranked 16th, the versatile carbohydrate that served as a bread substitute, a soup companion, and an emergency meal. In struggling African-American households, boxes of premium or sunshine crackers appeared in pantries with religious regularity. These simple squares of flour, water, and salt became infrastructure for poverty meals. Spread peanut butter on them for snacks, crumble them into soup for substance, layer them with cheese for pretend sandwiches, eat them plain when nothing else was available. Their utility was limited only by imagination and desperation. The cultural adaptation was significant. Traditional African-American cuisine featured homemade biscuits and cornbread, but when time or ingredients prevented real baking, saltines filled the gap. They accompanied beans, soups, and stews in ways that echoed traditional breadstuffs, but required zero preparation. The positive sides of this item are the extreme affordability, indefinite shelf life, and adaptability. A single sleeve of saltines could stretch through multiple meals, and their bland taste meant they paired with anything without complaint. The negatives, on the other hand, centered on nutritional emptiness and the reminder of scarcity they represented. Saltines were basically empty calories, offering minimal nutrition beyond carbohydrates. They went stale quickly once opened, their few moments of crispness giving way to chewy sadness. Children eating saltines for dinner understood viscerally that times were hard. Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid ranked 15th, the sugar water phenomenon that turned tap water into something children would actually drink. In African-American households of the 1970s, those packets cost mere pennies and transformed entire pitchers of water into neon-colored beverages. Cherry, grape, lemon lime, and tropical punch. Each flavor promised refreshment while delivering primarily sugar and artificial color. The ritual was familiar across Black America. Mix the packet with a mountain of sugar, add water, stir until dissolved, refrigerate if possible. Serve to children who guzzled it gratefully. The cultural significance was enormous. Kool-Aid became so embedded in African-American poverty culture that it spawned its own vocabulary and references. Drinking the Kool-Aid entered the lexicon through tragic circumstances, but the beverage itself was a daily reality in struggling households. It appeared at birthday parties, church gatherings, and summer afternoons when the heat made water inadequate. The positives were economic. Nothing else provided flavored drinks so cheaply or made water exciting for children who needed hydration, but resisted plain tap water. The negatives, however, were health-related and substantial. Kool-Aid was essentially colored sugar water, contributing to childhood obesity, diabetes, and dental problems in communities already facing health disparities. The sugar content was staggering, the nutritional value non-existent, and the artificial dyes questionable. Yet families bought it repeatedly because keeping children hydrated and happy mattered more than long-term health consequences that seemed abstract. Hamburger Helper. Introduced by Betty Crocker in 1971, this product specifically targeted struggling households where meat was precious and stretching it was essential. In African-American families of the 1970s, Hamburger Helper represented modern convenience intersecting with economic necessity. The box contained pasta shapes and a foil packet of powdered seasoning that promised to create everything from stroganoff to chili mac with minimal effort and maximum meat extension. The cultural adaptation involved substituting traditional African-American meat dishes with these quick alternatives. Where grandmothers once slow-cooked tough cuts until tender, mothers now mixed powder with hamburger and called it dinner. The positives here included genuine convenience and affordable protein extension. 1 pound of ground beef, often the cheapest meat available, could feed 6 people when mixed with Helper. The pasta provided bulk, the seasoning provided flavor, and dinner happened in under 30 minutes. However, the negatives were there, and they centered on taste and nutrition. Pasta was always slightly gummy, the seasoning aggressively salty and artificial. The overall effect reminiscent of of cafeteria food rather than home cooking. These meals were high in sodium, low in vegetables, and completely divorced from traditional foodways. Yet they appeared on tables throughout Black America because they worked. This ranking reflects Hamburger Helper's practical genius, balanced against its contribution to processed food dependency and the erosion of cooking skills in poor communities. It solved problems while creating new ones. Hot dogs. Hot dogs ranked 13th, the mystery meat that fed millions of struggling families with minimal investment. In African-American households of the 1970s, packages of hot dogs appeared with such regularity that they became background infrastructure for poverty meals. Oscar Mayer, Bar S, whatever was cheapest, these pink tubes contained mechanically separated meat products that nobody examined too closely because hunger didn't allow for squeamishness. Boiled, fried, microwaved, or eaten cold from the package, hot dogs required zero skill and provided quick protein. The versatility was remarkable. Hot dogs appeared in mac and cheese for extra protein. They floated in canned spaghetti for cheap bulk. They got sliced into beans, wrapped in biscuit dough, or simply placed in white bread with mustard. In Black communities, hot dogs transcended their processed origins to become fundamental building blocks of survival cuisine. The positives included extreme affordability and universal acceptance by children. Even the pickiest eaters would consume hot dogs, making them reliable weapons against food insecurity. The negatives were numerous. Hot dogs contained dubious ingredients, excessive sodium, questionable preservatives, and almost no nutritional value beyond calories and protein. They represented the industrialization of food at its most efficient and most disturbing. The texture was unnaturally uniform, the taste suspiciously consistent regardless of brand. Yet families purchased them religiously because they stretched thin budgets and prevented hungry children. Bologna. Bologna landed at 12, the everyman's meat that could be fried, sliced thin, or stacked thick depending on desperation level. In struggling African-American households, bologna represented meat accessibility. When ham and roast beef were financially impossible, the log could be purchased whole or pre-sliced, both options cheaper than almost any other protein. Fried bologna became a cultural staple in Black communities, the slices curling up in hot skillets into meat cups that could hold eggs or simply be sandwiched in white bread with mustard. Bologna sandwiches filled school lunchboxes throughout Black America, sometimes the only protein available for children during the school day. The lunchbox bologna sandwich became a marker of economic status, visible to classmates who had turkey or roast beef. Yet bologna also connected to traditional African-American food culture, where making do with less required creativity and skill. Frying bologna elevated it beyond cold cuts, transforming cheap processed meat into something approaching breakfast meat. The positives included versatility, affordability, and near-universal availability. The negatives, however, centered on quality and nutrition. Bologna was processed meat product containing more additives than actual meat, colored pink to suggest healthiness it didn't possess. The texture was suspiciously smooth, the flavor aggressively salty, the nutritional profile concerning. High in sodium and fat, low in actual nutrients, bologna contributed to health problems in communities already facing cardiovascular disease and hypertension. This ranking reflects bologna's cultural importance and practical utility, balanced against its questionable ingredients and health implications. It fed families, but at a cost beyond the price tag. Canned tuna. In African-American households of the 1970s, canned tuna represented seafood accessibility when fresh fish was expensive or unavailable. The cans came in oil or water, though oil-packed was often cheaper and more satisfying despite the grease. Opening a can released that distinctive fishy smell that permeated kitchens and announced economic status. But families learned to live with it because tuna provided real protein at budget prices. The versatility was substantial. Tuna salad sandwiches became lunchtime staples, mixing the fish with mayo, pickles, and onions to stretch one can into 4 sandwiches. Tuna casseroles combined the fish with noodles, cream of mushroom soup, and sometimes cheese for complete dinners. Tuna patties fried in hot oil became fish cakes that passed for more expensive seafood. In Black communities, tuna adapted to traditional seasoning profiles, incorporating hot sauce and celery seed in ways that connected processed convenience to cultural taste preferences. The positives included genuine nutritional value and remarkable cost-effectiveness. However, the negatives were sensory and practical. Canned tuna smelled aggressively fishy, tasted metallic from the can, and had texture issues that made some children gag. The oil-packed version was greasier, the water-packed version drier, neither quite right. Mercury concerns would later emerge, but in the 1970s, families simply consumed it regularly out of necessity. It was better than many alternatives, but still marked families as struggling. Spam. In many African American households of the 1970s, Spam represented a shelf-stable protein that could survive an apocalypse and still be edible. The blue can required that iconic key-operated opener, winding around the rim to release a gelatinous brick of pink mystery meat. What exactly went into Spam remained unclear, but families didn't ask questions because it provided protein when fresh meat was impossible. Fried Spam became a legitimate breakfast meat in Black communities, developing crispy edges that almost disguised its processed nature. Sliced thin for sandwiches or cubed into fried rice and beans, Spam's versatility exceeded its reputation. Hawaiian communities had already elevated Spam to cultural icon status, but African American families developed their own relationships with it based on necessity and creativity. The positives included indefinite shelf life, adaptability, and genuine protein content. Spam could be dressed up or down, featured or hidden, depending on available ingredients. The negatives were also substantial. Spam was aggressively salty, suspiciously uniform in texture, and questionable in composition. The sodium content was astronomical, the preservatives concerning, and the actual meat content debatable. Yet it appeared regularly in poor households because it solved the protein problem when everything else failed. This ranking reflects Spam's practical utility and cultural adaptation, balanced against its role as a symbol of poverty and its nutritional inadequacy. It fed families but represented the industrial food system's solution to poor people's hunger. Boxed macaroni and cheese. Kraft mac and cheese ranked 9th, the blue box that became cultural shorthand for childhood poverty and comfort simultaneously. In African American households of the 1970s, this product represented modern convenience meeting economic necessity. For minimal cost, the box provided pasta and a packet of neon orange powder that transformed into a cheesy sauce beloved by children and tolerated by adults. The preparation was simple enough for older children to handle, making it a teaching tool and time saver for working parents managing multiple jobs. Mac and cheese had deep roots in African American cuisine, from Harlem Renaissance soul food to traditional Southern cooking. But Kraft's version industrialized and simplified the dish, making it accessible to families who couldn't afford the time or ingredients for traditional baked mac and cheese. The bright orange color became iconic, the artificial cheese flavor became nostalgic, and generations of Black children grew up associating this box with home and safety, even as adults recognized its nutritional poverty. The positives included extreme affordability, kid-friendly taste, and extraordinary versatility. Add hot dogs for protein, mix in canned tuna for a fish dinner, bake it with breadcrumbs for attempted elevation. The box could be transformed based on available ingredients and ambition levels. The negatives, however, centered on nutrition and quality. The pasta was refined flour, the cheese powder was chemicals and dyes, and the overall nutritional profile was abysmal. But even with that, this product fed millions of children and became embedded in Black food culture. Pinto beans. Dried pinto beans landed at 8, the humble legume that connected poverty cooking to ancestral traditions. Bags of dried beans represented both affordable nutrition and cultural continuity. Beans had sustained enslaved Africans, freed people during Reconstruction, and Black families through Jim Crow and beyond. They required time, something poor families often lacked, but rewarded patience with nourishment and volume. One bag could feed a family for days, providing protein and fiber when meat was scarce. The preparation ritual mattered culturally, sorting through beans to remove rocks and debris, soaking them overnight, and simmering them with onions and ham hocks or fatback. These steps connected modern Black families to their ancestors, who had cooked the same ingredients under different circumstances. Beans served over rice became a complete protein, a scientific fact that grandmothers knew intuitively. The positives were substantial. Beans provided genuine nutrition, extreme affordability, cultural connection, and remarkable versatility. The negatives with this food were practical rather than substantive. Beans required planning and time. The soaking process could be forgotten, the cooking took hours, and dried beans waiting in the pantry didn't help immediate hunger. Yet beans remained central to African American poverty cooking because they worked on multiple levels simultaneously. This ranking reflects their superior nutrition, cultural significance, and traditional importance, balanced against the time requirements their preparation demanded. They were poverty food elevated by cultural meaning and nutritional reality. Rice. In the 1970s, massive bags of long-grain white rice appeared in Black households with the regularity of rent payments. Rice was mathematics, incredibly cheap, indefinitely storable, infinitely expandable, and nutritionally adequate when combined with other foods. 1 cup of dried rice became 3 cups of cooked rice, feeding multiple people from minimal investment. Rice wasn't traditional to West African diets in the same way it was to Asian cuisines, but it became embedded in African American food culture through the low-country rice cultivation history and its practical utility in poverty cooking. Rice and beans became a complete protein. Rice under gravy stretched expensive meat. Rice in soups added bulk. Rice as breakfast porridge with sugar provided morning fuel. Black families developed sophisticated rice dishes that elevated this simple grain through seasoning, technique, and tradition. The positives included superior nutrition compared to many poverty foods, extreme versatility, cultural adaptability, and reliability. Rice never spoiled if stored properly. It could be dressed up or down, and it provided genuine sustenance rather than empty calories. The negatives were minimal. White rice lacked the fiber and nutrients of brown rice, and eating it constantly could become monotonous. But despite this, rice's position in poverty cuisine was earned through merit. This ranking reflects its nutritional value, cultural importance, and practical utility. Rice wasn't just poverty food, it was smart food that happened to be affordable. Oatmeal. Oatmeal landed at 6, the breakfast grain that connected struggle to sustenance and poverty to tradition. In African American households of the 1970s, large cylindrical containers of Quaker oats sat in pantries as breakfast insurance. Oatmeal was mathematics and mercy combined, cheap, nutritious, filling, and flexible. It could be prepared with just water when milk wasn't available, sweetened with whatever sugar could be spared, and enhanced with margarine or, on special days, real butter. This was a survival breakfast that actually provided nutrition. Oatmeal connected to traditional African American morning meals, to the porridges that sustained enslaved people, to the hot breakfasts that differentiated care from mere feeding. Mothers who served oatmeal were ensuring their children left for school with warm food in their bellies, providing both nutrition and love in a bowl. The ritual of preparation mattered. The stirring, the waiting for proper thickness, the careful sweetening that made poverty palatable. The positives were substantial. Genuine nutrition, including fiber and slow-releasing energy, extreme affordability that meant breakfast could happen daily regardless of financial situation, and versatility that allowed personalization based on available ingredients. The negatives, however, were the texture-based resistance from children and the time requirement for proper cooking. Cabbage. Cabbage ranked 5th, a vegetable that stretched impossibly far and connected modern poverty cooking to traditional African American foodways. In struggling Black households of the 1970s, heads of cabbage appeared regularly because they were cheap, lasted forever in refrigerators, and could transform into multiple dishes. Boiled with potatoes, fried with bacon, stuffed with rice and meat, shredded into slaw, cabbage was endlessly adaptable and remarkably forgiving of whatever cooking method desperation required. Cabbage appeared in traditional African American cuisine from slavery forward, one of the few vegetables enslaved people could grow and keep. It appeared in soul food restaurants and home kitchens, at church dinners and family reunions. Cabbage represented culinary continuity, connecting generations through shared dishes that evolved based on available resources but maintained cultural identity. Fried cabbage with fatback was poverty food and cultural tradition simultaneously. The positives here included genuine nutritional value with vitamins and fiber, extreme affordability, remarkable versatility, and cultural resonance. One head could feed a family multiple meals. It never spoiled quickly. It could be prepared simply or elaborately, based on time and skill. The negatives, on the other hand, centered on the distinctive smell of cooking cabbage that marked households and the vegetable's association with poverty that made some families avoid it. But outside of these, cabbage was a smart food that nourished bodies and connected families to tradition. Cornmeal. In poor Black households of the 1970s, bags of cornmeal were essential infrastructure for feeding families when wheat flour was too expensive or unavailable. Cornbread, the obvious application, connected modern poverty to historical sustenance. But cornmeal's versatility extended beyond bread. Fried mush for breakfast, corn cakes for dinner, coating for fried fish, base for spoon bread, thickener for stews. One bag provided weeks of carbohydrates and cultural connection. Corn had sustained indigenous peoples, then enslaved Africans, then freed Black families through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and beyond. Cornmeal wasn't just poverty food, it was survival food elevated through technique and tradition into something beautiful. Black cooks developed cornbread recipes that varied by region, family, and available ingredients, but all shared the alchemy of transforming simple cornmeal into nourishment and comfort. The ritual of cornbread baking, mixing in cast iron, and achieving the proper crust connected families to their past while feeding their present. The positives were profound. Genuine nutrition, including fiber, extreme affordability, remarkable versatility, deep cultural significance, and the ability to create food that tasted good rather than merely adequate. Cornmeal made poverty meals taste like choice rather than necessity. The negatives were also minimal. Some children resisted its texture, and it required basic cooking skills. But apart from that, this ranking reflects cornmeal's superior position in African American poverty cuisine, representing the intersection of necessity, nutrition, culture, and skill. Government cheese. Government cheese ranked third, the orange block that became a cultural icon and a survival tool simultaneously. In African American households of the 1970s, this 5-pound brick of processed cheese product arrived through welfare programs and food assistance, providing dairy nutrition to struggling families. The cheese came in plain cardboard boxes, dense enough to use as a doorstop and orange enough to glow in the dark. It didn't melt properly. Slicing required a sharp knife and patience, but it made meals possible when protein and calcium were scarce. Government cheese represented both help and stigma, nutrition and shame. It marked families as poor, as needy, as recipients of government assistance in a society that criminalized poverty. Yet, within Black communities, government cheese became normalized, shared, and even joked about as a common experience that connected rather than divided. The cheese appeared in everything: grilled cheese sandwiches that held together family dinners, mac and cheese that stretched single boxes into full meals, and melted over vegetables to convince children to eat them. The positives included genuine nutrition with protein and calcium, absolute reliability once you qualified for assistance, and remarkable staying power. That block could last weeks, feeding families through entire months. The negatives only centered on taste, texture, and the psychological weight of marking oneself as poor. Powdered milk. Powdered milk landed at second place, the chalky compromise that kept calcium flowing into children's bodies when fresh milk was a luxury. In struggling African American households of the 1970s, large cardboard boxes of carnation powdered milk sat in pantries like monuments to making do. The powder had to be mixed with water, stirred vigorously to eliminate clumps, and chilled to disguise its fundamental wrongness. It smelled dusty, tasted thin and slightly bitter, and coated tongues with disappointment. Children knew instantly it wasn't real milk, but parents insisted it was nutritionally equivalent while quietly acknowledging the lie. The cultural context was significant. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, required refrigeration that poor families might not have reliable access to, and cost more than struggling budgets allowed. Powdered milk solved multiple problems simultaneously. It lasted forever, required no refrigeration before mixing, cost substantially less than fresh, and provided the calcium and protein children needed. Black mothers mixed it for cereal, used it in cooking, and sometimes blended it half and half with fresh milk to stretch resources without completely sacrificing taste. The positives were purely practical. Powdered milk prevented malnutrition in children, enabled breakfast cereal to happen, made cooking possible when recipes required dairy, and represented accessible nutrition regardless of financial situation. The negatives were only sensory and psychological. It tasted wrong, reminded children daily of poverty, and represented the gap between what families could provide and what they wished to provide. Peanut butter. Peanut butter ranked first, the protein-packed spread that transcended poverty to become universal nourishment. In African American households of the 1970s, jars of peanut butter, often generic brands with oil floating on top requiring vigorous stirring, represented affordable nutrition that could carry families through weeks of scarcity. Peanut butter sandwiches became lunchbox staples, after-school snacks, and sometimes dinner when nothing else was available. The spread provided protein, calories, and fat, the building blocks of survival when meat was unaffordable and hunger was constant. George Washington Carver, a Black scientist, had promoted peanuts and developed numerous uses for them, making peanut butter part of African American scientific and agricultural heritage. Yet by the 1970s, peanut butter represented democratic nutrition, available to all regardless of economic status. Government commodity programs distributed large cans of peanut butter to poor families, ensuring this protein source reached children who needed it most. In Black households, peanut butter transcended its poverty associations to become genuinely beloved. Mixed with jelly for classic sandwiches, spread on crackers for quick protein, or eaten straight from the jar when hunger was acute. The positives were overwhelming: genuine protein and healthy fats, extreme affordability, indefinite shelf life, universal appeal to children, versatility in preparation, and nutritional adequacy. Peanut butter could sustain children through school days, provide afternoon energy, and prevent malnutrition when money ran out before the month's end. The negatives were very minimal. Generic brands were grittier and required stirring. Some children had allergies, and its poverty associations carried stigma. But despite this, peanut butter earned its top ranking through sheer utility and impact. It was poverty food that actually nourished, comfort food that was genuinely comforting, and survival food that tasted good. Which of these old-school grocery staples would you still buy today? Let me know in the comments section. For more videos like this, click on this next card on your screen.